Someone just made the most expensive mistake of their life. The words were barely above a whisper, yet they seemed to hang in the air long before anyone understood what they meant. The Grand Monarch Ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers imported from Italy, their reflections dancing across polished marble floors and champagne glasses worth more than most monthly car payments. It was the kind of gala where senators shook hands with billionaires, where private equity executives traded smiles worth millions of dollars, and where appearances often mattered more than truth. At exactly 8:17 p.m., the annual Legacy of Tomorrow charity gala was in full swing. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying silver trays. A jazz quartet played softly near the stage. Laughter drifted through the room like expensive perfume. And standing near the back of the ballroom was a woman almost nobody seemed to notice. Naomi Carter wore a simple black evening dress. No diamonds, no designer logos, no entourage. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she controlled one of the largest infrastructure companies in America. That was intentional. Naomi had spent years learning that the easiest way to understand people was to let them underestimate her first. Across the room, the Whitmore family commanded attention without asking for it. Richard Whitmore stood surrounded by investors. His wife Victoria carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being admired. Their son Ethan moved through the crowd as if the event belonged to him. Tonight was supposed to be their victory lap. Rumors of a billion-dollar partnership had already spread among guests. Financial reporters lingered near the bar, hoping to catch a quote. Investors whispered about the future. Everything seemed perfect. Then Ethan spotted Naomi. At first, he barely glanced at her. Then he looked again. His eyes narrowed. He waved casually in her direction. "Excuse me," he called out. "Can I get another champagne?" A few nearby guests chuckled. Naomi didn't move. She simply looked at him. Ethan frowned. "I'm talking to you." The laughter grew louder. Naomi remained calm. "I don't work here," she said. Her voice was steady, measured, the kind of voice that refused to compete with noise. Ethan smirked. "Sure you don't." Victoria turned toward the exchange, amusement spreading across her face. Richard followed. Within seconds, several guests were watching. The room hadn't gone silent. Not yet. But something had shifted. Ethan stepped closer. "Come on. Don't be embarrassed. Just bring the drink." Naomi met his gaze. "No." The single word landed harder than anyone expected. A few people exchanged looks. Ethan's smile disappeared. Public rejection wasn't something he handled well. Victoria shook her head dramatically. "The help really has an attitude these days." More laughter followed. Naomi said nothing. She had heard comments like that before. Different city, different room. Same assumption, same mistake. The music continued. Glasses clinked. Conversations carried on. Yet the atmosphere around them felt strangely charged. Like the moment before a summer thunderstorm. Ethan leaned in slightly. "You know, people should dress appropriately if they want to be taken seriously at events like this." Several guests nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. Naomi remained perfectly still. She didn't defend herself. She didn't argue. She simply watched. And somehow that calm seemed to irritate them more than any response could have. What nobody in that ballroom realized was that the night had already begun to change. The Whitmore family believed they were standing at the height of their power. They believed the future belonged to them. They believed the most important signature in the room would soon be theirs. They were wrong. And before the evening was over, every person watching would understand exactly why. Naomi Carter did not arrive at the gala looking for attention. In fact, attention was the one thing she had carefully avoided all evening. While conversations swirled around her and cameras flashed near the stage, she stood quietly beside a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Manhattan. The city lights stretched for miles beneath the night sky, glowing like a sea of gold. Most people in the ballroom saw an unfamiliar woman standing alone. None of them saw the journey that had brought her there. 20 years earlier, Naomi had been a college student working 2 jobs while studying civil engineering. She had spent long nights delivering food, tutoring high school students, and saving every dollar she could. When other students spent spring break on beaches, Naomi spent hers studying contracts and business law at public libraries. She learned early that success was rarely handed to people who looked like her. It had to be built, one brick at a time. Years later, she founded Carter Global Infrastructure from a rented office barely larger than a storage closet. The company started with 3 employees, a folding table, and a dream that many investors dismissed. Some meetings lasted less than 5 minutes before potential partners decided she was not worth listening to. Others smiled politely while rejecting her proposals before she could finish presenting them. Naomi remembered every one of those rooms. She remembered every doubtful look, every assumption, every closed door. Yet somehow, she kept going. One project became 10. 10 became 50. 50 became hundreds. Bridges, transportation systems, energy networks. Entire communities transformed by projects her company delivered. By the age of 43, Carter Global Infrastructure operated in multiple countries and managed billions of dollars in assets. Yet despite the headlines, Naomi never forgot the lessons she learned before success arrived. That was why she often attended events like this without announcing who she was. Wealth revealed people, but anonymity revealed them even faster. Across the ballroom, Richard Whitmore laughed as another investor congratulated him on the partnership everyone expected to close before midnight. His confidence filled the room. Industry analysts had spent weeks discussing the deal. Financial networks described it as a game changer. Guests spoke about it as though the outcome had already been decided. Richard certainly believed it had. Ethan returned to his parents carrying 2 glasses of champagne. He glanced toward Naomi and shook his head with a laugh. Victoria smiled knowingly. None of them realized they were discussing the single person. Whose decision mattered most? Nearby, a young event coordinator named Emily Brooks watched the exchange with growing concern. She had spent years reading business magazines and leadership profiles. Something about Naomi's face seemed familiar. Emily studied her from across the room, trying to place where she had seen her before. The answer sat frustratingly close to memory. Then a large digital display near the stage briefly flashed highlights of major sponsors supporting the evening's charitable initiatives. Emily froze. Her eyes widened. She looked at the screen, then back at Naomi, then back again. A chill ran through her. Suddenly, she knew exactly who the woman by the window was. And as she looked toward the smiling Whitmore family, Emily realized they had absolutely no idea who they had just chosen to humiliate in front of an entire ballroom full of witnesses. Emily Brooks felt her pulse quicken as the realization settled in. She looked around the ballroom, wondering if anyone else had noticed what she had just noticed. Apparently not. The guests continued mingling beneath the chandeliers. Investors exchanged business cards. Reporters lingered near the stage. The Whitmore family remained at the center of attention, smiling as though the evening already belonged to them. Emily glanced again toward Naomi Carter. The woman stood exactly where she had been moments earlier, calm and composed beside the window overlooking Manhattan. There was no anger on her face, no embarrassment, no sign that the comments directed at her had landed at all. That unsettled Emily more than anything. Most people would have walked away. Others would have argued. Naomi had done neither. It was the kind of confidence that came from knowing something nobody else knew. Across the room, Ethan Whitmore was still entertaining a small circle of guests with exaggerated stories about business deals and luxury vacations. Every few minutes his eyes drifted back toward Naomi. The fact that she had refused to play along with his assumptions continued to bother him. He was used to people reacting, used to attention, used to getting the final word. Tonight had not gone according to plan. Richard Whitmore, meanwhile, was enjoying congratulations from investors who believed his company was on the verge of securing one of the largest partnerships in its history. The numbers being whispered around the room were staggering. $1 billion. New projects. Expansion into new markets. Financial news headlines already seemed written in advance. Richard accepted every compliment with the confidence of a man who believed success was guaranteed. What he did not realize was that the future he was celebrating remained completely uncertain. Near the stage, 2 investment analysts quietly discussed the expected deal. One described it as inevitable. The other called it the safest bet in the industry. Their conversation drifted through the crowd. Similar discussions echoed throughout the ballroom. The assumption had become fact. Everyone believed the agreement was already done. Everyone except the one person whose opinion actually mattered. Emily took a cautious step toward Naomi. Then another. She wanted to say something. To warn her. To apologize on behalf of a room that did not yet understand what it was witnessing. But before she could reach her, Victoria Whitmore appeared again. Her smile was polished. Her tone carried just enough sweetness to disguise the insult underneath. "You seem a little lost," she said. Several nearby guests turned their attention toward the exchange. Naomi slowly shifted her gaze from the city skyline to Victoria. "I know exactly where I am," she replied. The answer was simple, quiet, yet it seemed to land harder than Victoria expected. A few people exchanged glances. Something about Naomi's composure was beginning to attract attention. The room could feel it, not understanding it yet, but sensing it, like distant thunder rolling toward the city long before the storm arrived. Emily stopped walking and watched. Richard joined his wife. Ethan stepped closer as well. Without realizing it, the Whitmore family had formed a circle around the very person they should have been trying to impress. And somewhere inside Naomi's evening clutch rested a document that could change every future they had spent months planning. The Whitmores still believed. They controlled the night. They still believed the next few hours would end with celebration. But the closer they moved toward Naomi Carter, the closer they moved toward a truth that would leave an entire ballroom speechless. Emily Brooks could not stay silent any longer. The realization sitting in her mind felt heavier with every passing second. She looked around the ballroom again, almost expecting someone else to notice what she had noticed. Nobody did. The music continued. Servers moved between tables carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne. Guests admired the skyline beyond the towering windows. The entire room remained focused on the Whitmore family. Emily finally stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said carefully as she approached the group. Ethan glanced at her with mild annoyance. Richard barely acknowledged her presence. Victoria offered the kind of smile reserved for people she considered unimportant. Emily swallowed hard. "I think there may be a misunderstanding." Ethan laughed. "About what?" Emily looked directly at Naomi before returning her attention to the Whitmores. "I believe I know who she is." For a brief moment, the air seemed to pause. Several nearby guests turned toward the conversation. Naomi remained calm. Her expression did not change. Richard folded his arms. "And who exactly do you think she is?" Emily hesitated. She suddenly realized how ridiculous the truth might sound to people who had already decided what they believed. Before she could answer, Ethan shook his head dismissively. "Let me guess. She is secretly a billionaire, right?" A few people laughed. Victoria joined them. That would certainly make tonight more entertaining. Emily felt her confidence falter. The room was working against her. Every smile, every raised eyebrow, every assumption, they all pushed in the same direction. Richard stepped closer. "You are an event coordinator. Focus on your responsibilities. We are having a private conversation." The dismissal hit Emily immediately. Her face flushed. Yet something about Naomi's calm presence encouraged her to continue. She took a breath. "I am serious. I recognize her." Ethan rolled his eyes. "From where?" Emily opened her mouth, but before she could answer, a new distraction emerged. Near the stage, several reporters suddenly gathered around a digital presentation screen displaying information about major charitable sponsors. Their movement briefly drew attention away from the conversation. Emily looked toward the screen and then back toward Naomi. The same name appeared there again. Carter Global Infrastructure, one of the evening's largest sponsors. The connection felt impossible to ignore. Yet somehow the Whitmores ignored it completely. Richard chuckled and adjusted his cufflinks. This is exactly why people should avoid making assumptions. The irony of the statement slipped past him entirely. Naomi's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, not from anger, but from observation. She watched every word, every reaction, every choice being made around her. It was the same way she evaluated executives during negotiations, the same way she assessed potential partners before investing millions of dollars. Across the ballroom, a large antique clock mounted above the stage showed 8:41 p.m., less than 4 hours remained before midnight. Less than 4 hours before a decision that would alter multiple companies and thousands of jobs. Emily knew none of the details behind the deal. She only knew one thing with certainty. The Whitmore family was standing dangerously close to a cliff they could not see. Richard still believed he controlled the room. Ethan still believed he controlled the conversation. Victoria still believed she understood exactly who belonged in their world. But as Naomi's hand briefly touched the small evening clutch resting at her side, Emily had a feeling that everything the Whitmores believed was about to be tested by a truth far more expensive than any mistake they had ever made before. The clock above the stage moved to 8:47 p.m., and the atmosphere inside the ballroom continued to shift in ways most people could not yet explain. Conversations still filled the room, but more eyes were drifting toward the growing circle around Naomi Carter. Curiosity had replaced amusement. Something felt different now. Even those who knew nothing about her could sense it. Richard Whitmore noticed the attention and interpreted it as support. Years of privilege had trained him to mistake silence for agreement. He smiled confidently and addressed the small crowd gathering nearby. "Events like this attract all kinds of people," he said. "Sometimes people enjoy pretending to be part of rooms they have not earned their way into." A few guests laughed politely. Others looked uncomfortable. Naomi remained still. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply listened. The calmness in her posture seemed almost unnatural. Victoria folded her arms. "Most successful people understand presentation," she added. "The first impression matters." Her eyes moved briefly across Naomi's simple black dress. The message was obvious. Nearby, Emily Brooks felt her stomach tighten. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Every word made the situation worse. Every assumption pushed the Whitmores deeper into a hole they did not know they were digging. Naomi glanced toward the skyline beyond the glass windows. Thousands of lights stretched across Manhattan. The view triggered a memory she had not thought about in years. At 26, she had entered a corporate reception in Chicago carrying engineering proposals she had spent months preparing. Nobody had greeted her. Several people assumed she was administrative staff. One executive had handed her an empty coffee cup without even looking at her name badge. She remembered standing alone near a wall while people discussed opportunities she was never invited to join. That night had hurt, not because they underestimated her, because they never gave themselves the chance to know her. Years later, the faces had changed. The buildings had changed. The cities had changed. But the pattern remained painfully familiar. Back in the ballroom, Ethan Whitmore stepped forward again. "You know," he said with a grin, "if you wanted access to this crowd, all you had to do was ask." A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Emily finally spoke. "You should stop." Her voice was stronger this time. Ethan looked at her. "Excuse me." "You should stop talking," Emily said. The room grew quieter. Richard frowned. Victoria stared at her. Emily looked directly at them. "You do not understand who you are speaking to." For the first time all evening, uncertainty flickered across a few faces. It lasted only a second. Ethan laughed. "Then tell us." Emily hesitated. Before she could answer, Naomi gently raised a hand. Not to stop her, not to silence her, simply to signal patience. The gesture was small, but Emily understood immediately. Naomi wanted the truth to arrive on its own. Across the room, a server passed by carrying a tray of sparkling water. Naomi reached for a glass. As she did, her evening clutch shifted slightly. For the briefest moment, a corner of a thick document became visible inside. A legal contract. Several pages. Official signatures already covered most of the final section. Only one signature line remained blank. Naomi glanced down at it for less than a second before closing the clutch again. Nobody noticed except Emily. And when Emily saw it, her eyes widened. Suddenly, she understood that the future the Whitmores had been celebrating all night might be resting inches away from Naomi's hand. The realization sent a chill through her. Because if she was right, then the most important decision in the entire ballroom had not been made yet. At 8:56 p.m., the energy inside the Grand Monarch Ballroom had changed completely. Nobody announced it. Nobody acknowledged it. Yet people felt it. Conversations that had once filled the room now carried pauses. Guests who had been discussing investments and politics found themselves glancing toward Naomi Carter every few minutes. Curiosity had replaced certainty. Across the ballroom, Richard Whitmore continued shaking hands and accepting congratulations, but even he seemed distracted now. The attention he usually commanded was beginning to drift elsewhere. Naomi stood near the window exactly as she had before, holding a glass of sparkling water. Calm, patient, watching. She looked less like a guest and more like someone waiting for a clock only she could see. Emily Brooks remained nearby. The image of the contract inside Naomi's clutch refused to leave her mind. She had only seen it for a moment, yet the significance felt enormous. Several signatures already covered the document. One line remained blank. One decision remained unfinished. And somehow, The future of the Whitmore family appeared connected to that missing signature. Across the room, Ethan Whitmore noticed the growing attention surrounding Naomi and interpreted it as a challenge. He walked toward her again, smiling as if he were performing for an audience. "You know," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "most people come to events like this to make connections. You seem determined to avoid them." A few nervous laughs followed. Naomi looked at him. "Not every valuable connection begins with an introduction." The answer landed softly, yet several guests exchanged looks. Ethan's smile weakened. Richard approached as well. His confidence remained intact, but irritation had begun creeping into his expression. "My son is only trying to be friendly," he said. Naomi nodded politely. "I am sure that is how he sees it." The response was impossible to argue with and somehow made the room even quieter. Nearby, two investors who had been discussing the expected partnership suddenly stopped talking altogether. They were listening now. Everyone seemed to be listening. The ballroom felt smaller than before. The walls had not moved, but attention had compressed the space. Richard checked his watch. The movement seemed insignificant, but Naomi noticed it immediately. So did Emily. Time mattered tonight, more than anyone realized. Less than 3 hours remained before midnight. Less than 3 hours before decisions became permanent. Near the stage, organizers began preparing for the evening's final presentations. Technicians adjusted lighting. Staff reviewed schedules. A large screen displayed sponsor information in rotating intervals. Every few minutes, the name Carter Global Infrastructure appeared among the featured organizations supporting the event. Each time it appeared, Emily watched Naomi. Naomi never reacted. She did not need to. The truth did not become more powerful when announced. Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore continued speaking confidently about future growth, future contracts, and future opportunities. The word future seemed to follow him everywhere. Yet for the first time all evening, uncertainty had entered the room. Small at first, barely noticeable, but growing. Because the closer the clock moved toward midnight, the more it seemed that one woman standing quietly beside a window held the ability to change everything the Whitmores believed was already theirs. At 9:08 p.m., the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. The soft feedback ripple immediately drew attention from every corner of the ballroom. Conversations faded. Glasses lowered. The final segment of the evening was beginning. A spotlight illuminated the stage as sponsor acknowledgments appeared across the massive screen behind it. Richard Whitmore straightened his jacket and smiled. This was familiar territory. Public recognition. Applause. Admiration. He expected all three. The screen cycled through names of major donors and corporate partners supporting the gala. One after another appeared in polished gold lettering. Then a new slide filled the screen. Carter Global Infrastructure. The logo stretched across 20 feet of digital display. A brief description followed. Industry leader. Multi-billion-dollar portfolio. National infrastructure innovator. Several guests nodded in recognition. Some even applauded. Richard barely glanced at it. To him, it was simply another company on a long list of successful organizations. Emily Brooks looked from the screen directly toward Naomi. Her heart pounded. The truth was sitting in plain sight now. Yet somehow the Whitmores still did not see it. The presenter continued speaking. Tonight we would also like to recognize one of our most influential supporters, a visionary leader whose investments have helped transform communities across the country. A few people looked around the room curiously. Richard adjusted his watch. Ethan checked his phone. Victoria smiled politely. None of them realized the next sentence was about to change everything. Please join me in thanking the founder and chief executive officer of Carter Global Infrastructure, Ms. Naomi Carter. The ballroom froze. Not gradually. Instantly. It was as though every sound in the room had been pulled away at once. Naomi remained standing near the window. The spotlight found her before anyone else did. Heads turned. Dozens at first. Then hundreds. Expressions shifted across the ballroom like falling dominoes. Confusion. Recognition. Shock. Richard Whitmore stared at Naomi. Then at the screen. Then back at Naomi again. Ethan's smile disappeared completely. Victoria's face lost its color. Emily watched the realization hit them one piece at a time. Naomi calmly set down her glass of sparkling water. She did not rush. She did not celebrate. She simply walked toward the stage with the same quiet confidence she had carried all evening. The crowd parted naturally as she passed. Nobody spoke. Nobody seemed capable of speaking. Naomi reached the stage and accepted the microphone. The room waited. Richard Whitmore stood motionless. His future suddenly felt far less certain than it had 10 minutes earlier. Naomi looked across the ballroom. Her gaze briefly settled on the Whitmore family. Then she opened her evening clutch. The contract appeared. Thick, official, covered in signatures. Every page reflected months of negotiations, years of planning, billions of dollars in potential value. She held it up just enough for those closest to see. Then she looked directly at Richard. "Interesting evening," she said calmly. The silence deepened. "I have spent months evaluating partnerships based on character, judgment, and leadership." Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a drink. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the final page of the contract. The only unsigned line remained visible. Then she looked back at the Whitmores. "And tonight," she said softly, "I finally received my answer." For several seconds, nobody reacted. The ballroom stood suspended between disbelief and realization. Richard Whitmore stared at the contract in Naomi Carter's hand as though willing reality to change. Ethan looked around the room searching for reassurance, but every familiar face now carried the same expression. Shock. The certainty that had followed the Whitmore family all evening had vanished. In its place stood a truth they could not ignore. Naomi lowered the document and rested it calmly against the podium. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room was listening more carefully than it had all night. "Partnerships are built on more than projections," she said. "More than presentations. More than numbers on a balance sheet." Every word seemed to echo through the ballroom. Several investors exchanged uneasy glances. They had spent months evaluating financial forecasts. Naomi had spent the evening evaluating something entirely different. Character, judgment, integrity. Richard finally stepped forward. His confidence had cracked, but he fought to hold on to what remained. "Naomi," he said carefully, "I think there has been a misunderstanding." The sentence immediately drew attention. Hours earlier, he had not even known her name. Now he spoke it with urgency. Naomi looked at him without hostility, without satisfaction, simply with clarity. "A misunderstanding," she repeated. Richard nodded quickly. "If there was any offense, I apologize." Around the room, guests recognized what was happening. The language of power was changing. Earlier, the Whitmores had spoken from a position of certainty. Now they were negotiating. Ethan stepped forward as well. Nobody intended any disrespect. The statement hung awkwardly in the air. Too many witnesses had heard the comments. Too many people had watched the assumptions unfold. Emily Brooks lowered her eyes. Even she knew the explanation sounded weak. Naomi remained composed. "Intentions matter," she said. "But outcomes matter too." Silence followed. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a reporter quietly opened a notebook. Others began reaching for phones. News traveled quickly in rooms like this. Richard glanced toward the contract again. The unsigned page seemed larger than ever. For months, analysts had described the agreement as transformational. Investors had celebrated it before it existed. Shareholders expected it. Executives depended on it. Entire growth strategies had been built around it. And now everything rested on a single decision. Naomi looked across the audience. Hundreds of people watched her. Some curious, some nervous, some inspired. "Business reveals who people are," she continued. "But power reveals it even faster." The words landed with unmistakable weight. Victoria Whitmore lowered her gaze. Ethan said nothing. Richard stood perfectly still. The room no longer saw a family at the height of success. It saw a family confronting the consequences of its own assumptions. Naomi opened the contract one final time. The audience collectively leaned forward. She studied the final page for a moment. Then she slowly closed the document. The soft sound echoed louder than applause. Richard's expression changed immediately. He understood. So did everyone else. The decision had been made. Months of planning disappeared in a single motion. $1 billion in opportunity was gone. No dramatic gesture. No argument. No celebration. Just a choice. Calm. Deliberate. Final. And as the reality settled across the ballroom, the Whitmore family realized that the most expensive loss of their lives had begun long before the contract was closed. It had begun the moment they decided they already knew who Naomi Carter was. The ballroom remained silent long after Naomi Carter closed the contract. It was the kind of silence money could not buy and influence could not control. Every person in the room understood they had just witnessed something far more valuable than a business decision. They had witnessed a lesson. Richard Whitmore stood motionless near the front of the crowd. The confidence that had surrounded him earlier had disappeared completely. Investors who had spent the evening seeking his attention were no longer looking at him. They were looking at Naomi. Reporters who had arrived expecting to cover a successful partnership now scribbled notes about an entirely different story. Across the room, guests exchanged quiet conversations. Not about projections, not about markets, not about growth. They were discussing character. Naomi stepped away from the podium and looked across the ballroom one final time. Her expression remained calm. There was no triumph in her face, no desire to embarrass anyone. The decision she had made was not driven by revenge. It was driven by standards. That difference mattered. Richard finally spoke. His voice was lower than before. Naomi, is there anything I can do to change your mind? The question hung in the air. Earlier that evening, he had believed he held all the leverage. Now he stood asking for another chance. Naomi considered him for a moment. A partnership is built long before a contract is signed, she said. Tonight simply revealed what was already there. Nobody argued. Nobody could. Ethan Whitmore lowered his eyes. Victoria remained silent. For the first time all evening, the Whitmore family seemed to understand the full cost of assumptions. Naomi turned toward the audience. Hundreds of eyes followed her. Some people looked inspired. Others looked reflective. Many looked uncomfortable. That was understandable. The lesson was not meant only for the Whitmores. It belonged to everyone in the room. Naomi spoke one final time. The easiest thing in the world is to judge someone based on what you think you see. Their clothes, their appearance, their background, their race, their title. The harder thing is taking the time to learn who they actually are. The room listened carefully. Every opportunity begins with respect. The moment respect disappears, opportunity usually follows. Several guests nodded. Even those who had never spoken to Naomi seemed affected by her words. The ballroom felt different now. Lighter somehow. Honest. Emily Brooks stood near the back of the crowd and smiled quietly. She had spent the evening watching people underestimate someone extraordinary. Now she was watching them learn from it. Naomi thanked the organizers, handed the microphone back to the master of ceremonies, and stepped down from the stage. Applause began slowly. Then it grew. Soon the entire ballroom was standing. The sound filled every corner of the building. Naomi acknowledged the crowd with a small nod and began walking toward the exit. No entourage, no celebration, no dramatic farewell. Just the same quiet confidence she had carried from the beginning. Outside, Manhattan shimmered beneath the night sky. The city looked exactly as it had hours earlier. But inside the Grand Monarch Ballroom, everything had changed. And as the doors closed behind Naomi Carter, one truth remained impossible to ignore. She had never raised her voice. She had simply raised the standard.